welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. I'm here with Mr. Judge Tunheim. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure, Robbie. I'm glad to be here today. My name is John Tunheim. I'm a federal district court judge. I'm in my 30th year as a federal judge in Minneapolis, and I was chair of the Assassination Records Review Board 1994 to 1998 when we declassified many of the assassination records from the assassination of President Kennedy.
Can you tell me a little bit, like just for some new listeners out there, a little background of what your role for the Assassination Records Review Board was? I know we've talked about previously in the past about some of the, I guess, important disclosures when it came to the Lopez report, but just specifically what you were entitled to do for your job, certain restrictions and redactions that were kind of requirements that were met for you to be able to declassify a document.
Yeah, there was a standard that we had to apply. It was a standard that skewed heavily toward opening records. Under the statute, we were to assess the public interest in the particular information in a record that an agency wanted to protect, and public interest we determined was high in any Kennedy assassination record. There's no question about that. So it was a pretty high bar to protect it. But we were to look at protecting information that might compromise an intelligence gathering method that was not widely known, intelligence gathering operation that was still in effect that might be compromised by release of the information, an ongoing law enforcement investigation that might be compromised, a method of protecting the president that was not known to the public and might endanger a president. And also there was a personal kind of damaging information about an individual that was an additional category that we could look at. I think we only used that once or twice throughout the entire 4 years we did our work. It was primarily looking at national security related disclosures that we were convinced should be delayed for a period of time. It was our view that nothing should be delayed forever, that there's an end to this. We anticipated the end to all redactions being in 2017. Obviously, that didn't happen when President Trump was in office during his first term, but there were more records released, and now I haven't had a chance to go through all the records that have been recently released. I understand that there are still some redactions in them. I'm hoping that at some point in time here, everything will be released because that was the intent of our work.
Now, you said for everything to be released. That was the intent of the Assassination Records Review Board before it went out when you guys stopped doing your guys' work and everything and the ARRB was officially over with. Did you have any notice or did you have anything in mind when it came to trying to get the overall goal completed? I mean, it was supposed to be until the release of all JFK files, and obviously when you guys stopped, there wasn't the release of all the files.
Yeah, so there were a lot of redactions. I wouldn't say a lot. There were redactions that we placed release dates behind. So, for example, someone who was an informant for the CIA, who the agency convinced us was still living and would come to some harm if that informant status would be known publicly. In some of those cases, we agreed with the agency and redacted that person's name, although it was a strange exercise because we had to make a determination about when we thought it was unlikely the person would still be living because of age. So we put a date in there, and the National Archives throughout the time between 1998 and 2017 would be releasing those redactions when the date had passed. So we did that. That was one thing that we did to make sure that they would keep on releasing information.
Is this the final determination notices?
Yeah, it was in the final determination notices, but it was also on the document itself. It was a detail that was noted that this name should be released as of September 2008, or whatever date we selected. There were different dates that we selected based on when we thought someone would still be, would no longer be alive, just because of age. That was our determination there. The second thing we did was we signed documents with all of the agencies, memorandums of understanding, which were signed when we were still in operation, that they agreed any assassination record that would fall under our definition of an assassination record would have to be turned over to the National Archives. Obviously, we weren't around to monitor that, to make sure that that was being done. I'm guessing that agencies probably for the most part ignored that memorandum of understanding, but we signed them with every agency in which they agreed that they would turn over any record that they found after we were no longer in office to the National Archives for ultimate release to the public. So we did that. And I think that for the most part, we left very little to 2017. There were a few things that we left, and out of a pretty small percentage out of the total number of pages, total number of records. There's over 6 million pages now of Kennedy assassination records, so there's a lot of stuff there that still remains to be gone through.
Now, I think the work that you and the other ARRB members did specifically was some of the most important things for, especially my generation, trying to catch up on looking at a more fuller record, or at least pieces to the puzzle. But I wanted to ask, when it came to the ARRB closing down and the power being transferred to the National Archives, if we talk about also the final determination notices, what what would be the excuse for that not reaching some of the people that were supposed to carry on that mission of releasing those files? I'm not trying to get conspiratorial at all, but I'm talking about just a sense of maybe neglect or non-caring. As much as I care, you care now, and then other members or researchers care about the JFK assassination, it hasn't really been publicized unless it's been anniversary events. And it's not the main focus when we're talking about, like, if you examine the hearings, a more today political conversation. So obviously neglect could be a reason why, but it's always been so strange for me, wondering why this wasn't, after discovering the final determination notices, of how this just wasn't at the prime front spot for a lot of these people that are involved in this.
Yeah, I mean, it we were concerned about that. I was hoping the National Archives would take the position that they took over all of our powers and could do declassifications. Don't think they've ever really done that on their own. They relied on the agency to tell them that they could declassify a document uh, rather than take it on themselves. And it isn't entirely clear in the law that they could take on that power. I'd hope that they would have. Someone could challenge that in court, of course, but I think Congress might have given them more direct authority if there had been a challenge, a public challenge. Part of it is the lack of resources, the change of personnel at the National Archives. When we did our work, we had a liaison at the National Archives, Steve Tilley, who was absolutely terrific. He was so helpful. I remember right after I was confirmed, I met with him at the National Archives. He brought me into this when the archives were still, Kennedy assassination records were still downtown. They're at College Park now, as you know. It's a bit of a hike out there to get to them. They were still downtown. He showed me everything. He raised issues. He was absolutely terrific. We had a great liaison. Steve retired not too many years after we finished our work, maybe close after that time. He reached retirement age. And the subsequent people put in the positions didn't really have the experience or the knowledge that Steve did. And I think that's part of it as well. It's a big organization. They maintain a lot of records, and I can't fault them for not placing a high priority on the assassination records. I mean, that likely would have been a requirement of the Congress telling them to do that, and they would have done it. But I don't think that ever came from the Congress. So the results in years since we were in office were spotty. But after all, we were an organization, an agency that had specific declassification authority. That's a rarity. It's never happened before with an outside agency having this power Of course, our decisions could have been appealed to the president, and many were actually from the FBI. But President Clinton never reversed any of our decisions. He was very supportive of our work, and we had really the right atmosphere for getting this work done. And the number of redactions were relatively small, and I'm hopeful that eventually here we'll have an assessment that says everything's released. There's nothing redacted anymore. I don't think we can say that quite yet.
Based on the President Clinton versus President Trump on declassification of records, who would you say did a better job when it came to overall security? I guess of maintaining certain things that should have been classified, because obviously there's a lot of problem with social security numbers and stuff being released in this one, which I do not agree with. I didn't even think that was a concern, to be honest with you. Many times we've talked about files, the people that would be involved in this thing, a lot of them have moved on or passed away. So I never thought that that would be an issue, but obviously the person who was at the JFK hearing about the National Archives, that was a concern for them. So I'm curious, would you say Clinton had some areas that were better than maybe the way Trump handled this type of situation when it came to declassification of files?
Well, President Clinton was strongly supportive of releasing as many files as possible. He did not say, I don't want you to delve into this or delve into that. It was like, if it's related in any respect to the assassination, it should be released. And, he was very interested in the subject. Um, I will say that. I mean, we had a very interesting conversation at the end with him. He had good questions. He was really on top of it. And the fact that he never overruled us, even though he had considerable pressure from the agencies who appealed our decisions, he never did. And I think that he was strongly supportive of the release of records and directed agencies to cooperate with us. And President Trump, I mean, he's doing a good job in getting focus on this and getting records released. Um, it seems a little bit disorganized, I would say. I haven't had a chance to look through what's been released. It's a little hard to access and figure out what's what. Eventually, I hope to be able to make sure that what we had protected, the few things we protected, will be released now or have been released. But I will say that my direct experience was with President Clinton, and he was really a strong supporter of getting the information out to the public. I think he even said, you know, I don't know what happened. I'm curious, like everyone else is, but let's get all the records out, and then people can decide for themselves what happened. They can make their own conclusion based on what they see in the records. And I think that was our uh, our goal throughout the entire process.
When you requested files from the Secret Service, and then 2 weeks later they destroyed some of those files, I believe that we do have some of those copies. I've heard some things from some people that run the Mary Farrell site that there are some copies and some that we don't have. So I'm curious, did you think Trump would have handled it differently? Like, was that an issue that was brought up to Clinton? I'm just wondering from a basis of what I've seen from this president compared to maybe a history of Clinton's or your experience with Clinton in office, if they would actually handle some of these agencies in a matter of keeping up to the work that the ARRB should be doing or what they're entitled to do, rather than just doing their own agency thing.
Yeah, I mean, that was the only example that I knew of agencies trying to destroy records after we were in office or even shortly before we went into our office. Um, you know, I My recollection at the time was what we were told were destroyed were records that had already been released and were already part of the collection. A lot of these records had different agency control. So a document might have, you might find the document in the files of the Department of State. You might also find it in CIA records. You might also find it in Secret Service records. A lot of records were in a lot of places. Good example here is we were trying to get records out of the Kennedy Library in Boston, which was they were cooperative, up to a point. They weren't anxious to have records released, but they were not uncooperative. And one of the roadblocks was, well, we can't release this because there's three different agencies that have control over this document because it's in each of their files and it's listed at the top of the document. So my solution to that was to gather every one of these agencies that had any kind of provenance in a document that they had at the Kennedy Library to meet for a week and do declassification sessions with everybody at the table. It worked really well. That was one way to get all these records released relatively quickly. The discussions were good, and we got a lot of records released from the Kennedy Library, which had been difficult for us before that. So, the Secret Service was probably the most difficult for us to deal with, and understanding a very difficult day, darkest day in the history of the Secret Service, but destroying records isn't the way to address that issue. I mean, they had gone through and changed everything about presidential protection based on the assassination of President Kennedy. They were behind that. So there's really no reason to destroy records. And I think they were the only agency that destroyed anything, at least what we knew about. I wouldn't put that past the CIA, but I don't know that for a fact.
When we first talked a little while back on our very first conversation, we talked about Trump saying, if you saw what I saw, then you wouldn't release them either. And then obviously, a few years later, we get the full release of JFK files and this declassification. What were your thoughts when that happened, when he signed that agreement?
Well, I think that he was probably, two things. One is I'm sure that he got a briefing from the CIA and they raised all kinds of red flags for him. I'm familiar with that because we had those meetings with the CIA as well, in which they told us that we couldn't release certain information because whatever their answer was, it would destroy a current intelligence gathering operation, or it would cause someone to be killed. I mean, they had all kinds of reasons for it. Sometimes they were good reasons. Oftentimes they were not, in our view, and we didn't accept them. My only thought there was that they probably went in and gave him a briefing and scared him with all kinds of wild things that could happen if he released the records. The other explanation is that perhaps he was exaggerating. I don't know. It's he liked to call attention to his desire to release the records, which is a good thing, but at the same time, kind of heightening the importance of them more than what they really deserved.
But then when he announced that he was going to release all the files and he signed that, did did you have any concern of how they would be able to cover some of the issues or some of just the declassification standards? Or obviously he just kind of released them all. But it was always to me like I was like, how are you going to have a team of people work on it? Because everyone was counting down the days for the release, and I was like, I don't know how you could, with however many files. I think it went from like a couple thousand to like they found 80 or they found another thousand or something that the FBI had. And I'm sure there's plenty more out there, but maybe just copies of something that we already have. But for me, I was just like, I don't know how you would have a team of people sitting, no lunch and no dinner, just going through it all night under a lamp.
Well, I was told that there were a lot of people, all hands on deck at the Department of Justice, going over records the entire night before, all night long, trying to figure out if anything needed to be redacted. That's really not the way to do this. It should be an organized process with experienced people involved in declassifying. So I don't think it was probably handled in the best way, but I appreciate the goal of getting everything released, and I think that was important.
Did you think you had an advantage on the R because of the fact that you necessarily weren't so interested in the Kennedy assassination? You might be afterwards, but you necessarily, in the first time we talked, you mentioned about how you kind of didn't have an interest in following it. You kind of were just open to, so you didn't really have a bias.
Yeah, I think all of us were interested, as any American would be interested, because it was such a tragic event, and all of us on the review board had experienced it, and many of our senior staff members, like Tom Samlick, had experienced it and remembered it. But at the same time, I hadn't really dived into reading any of the books, coming up with any conclusions myself. And I think that was important for us to not go in with the idea that we knew exactly what happened and we were out there to try to prove it, because we weren't. We were out there to release as much as we could and remember that goal that President Clinton gave us of releasing as much as possible and letting people decide for themselves, not telling them what happened, but what should have been done 30 years earlier, releasing all the records and let people decide rather than being told exactly what happened.
Were you contacted at all when they were going to have another hearing with Luna and Jefferson Morley, Oliver Stone, and Jim Diucino?
Yeah, I got a call, I believe it was Thursday before the hearing, which was set for Tuesday. And I talked for a long time to a staff member from the committee. And he asked me if I could come and testify. And that was just too late for me to change my schedule. I was in the middle of a criminal trial, jurors coming in. I could not take that particular day off. I told them that if they had another hearing, I'd be very happy to testify and give them my thoughts and answer any questions that they had. But it was just too last minute for me to change my schedule, because a trial involves scheduled witnesses and lawyers' time and jurors coming in, and it's just at the last minute it's too hard to change.
What did you think about the kind of JFK conversation being brought into the more political one when it was talking at the JFK hearing? It was a little upsetting for some of us.
I think it's unfortunate. It really is. This is not a political issue. This is an issue about you're releasing information that Americans and literally people around the world deserve to see. And there's nothing political about that. I think we had bipartisan support for our work. I don't recall anyone objecting to the fact that we were doing our work. The one person who objected to the creation of the review board in the beginning was President George H.W. Bush, who thought that the law was unconstitutional. It was an infringement on the president's power to oversee the declassification of records. And, I understood that argument. I think Congress carefully drafted the law so that it wasn't unconstitutional and giving the president the ultimate say by appeal from our decisions. So it was okay, but I don't think there was much opposition in the Congress to getting this done, and we certainly didn't experience that during our time. We didn't have any political requests of any kind. The Kennedy family largely stayed on the sidelines and was not, involved in pushing us one way or the other on anything. So we were free to really do our work on the merits, which is what we had hoped would be the case.
Now, how does it differ now in 2025 compared to when you were doing the work for the Assassination Records Review Board and you were having hearings where people were coming in and giving you information where you sat? I've seen many videos of you on C-SPAN with a panel of people beside you listening to certain individuals give you information or just their account or experience on something.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I thought it was important for us to gather information from the public, from interested researchers, people who had worked on their own books. They'd worked on prior investigations. We just wanted to hear from everybody. Anyone who wanted to speak got the opportunity to provide us with testimony. They could send it in writing if they wanted. We'd take it into account, or they could appear at a hearing and we'd give them the right to speak. And I thought that was important. We learned a lot from these sessions. Even if someone came up with a conspiracy theory that fell more on the side of the wackiness side, shall we say, yeah, you still learned from that. You learned what people were talking about. You learned what people were thinking about, and it helped guide us to push in certain other areas for records. A good example is, there was a number of people that pushed us that they felt that President Kennedy was killed because he was about to withdraw military advisors from Vietnam. That's not a viable theory, I don't think. But at the same time, someone's made this claim. So we gathered up remaining records of the Kennedy administration and Vietnam policy that hadn't been released and declassified them. So that's an example of what the hearings could bring to us, is just what people were thinking, what people were doing. And we didn't have to take sides on any of this. We didn't want to. That was not our approach. If someone suggested information was important, we would try to find it.
I know your work necessarily, you still follow this, but I know you're not necessarily as involved as you were. But when it came to an establishment of another hearing or something that you thought maybe you could put together, when it came to just listening to folks who have looked through the documents, are sticking to the facts, not getting into the wild conspiracy theory aspects, but just giving people the allotted time to say what they've learned in a more formatted version, not necessarily being asked specific questions by, like I said, with the hearing, Congress people that necessarily don't have any information on. I mean, mixing up Oliver Stone and Roger Stone, I was confused for a minute. I didn't know what she was hinting at. I thought I had to go buy another Oliver Stone book or something. But I think more informed questions, like if members of the Assassination Records Review Board, any members, and there are still some alive of the HSCA, that could just reach out and be like, let's do a hearing where I can ask you questions that I came across and then have a more formatted discussion with knowledgeable researchers.
That would be wonderful, and it would be a good way for people to understand better what's going on rather than trying to follow the research, through particular individuals who might be researchers, but others are not out there. And it's you hear a wide spectrum of information, which is good for the public, I think. I mean, you could hear from people who believe that Lee Harvey Oswald did it. You hear from people who have come up with new conspiracy theories. You can hear from people who are investigating the CIA's potential role in the assassination. And this would be a really good idea. I mean, Congress could sponsor that, I suppose. But I think that it's kind of in the nature of the hearings that we had and the conferences that we had with, say, the staff of the HSCA, which was very, very illuminating for us and very helpful for us. The meetings that we had with, members of the staff of the Warren Commission, which I thought was really, really helpful as well. And so there's much that can be done to illuminate, some of the issues that still remain. I don't think we're ever going to run into a period where we think, well, everything's found out and we know exactly what happened. It's just not in the nature of things. I used to do when I was chair of the board. I'm sure Tom Samlick set this up for me, but there was a lot of evening talk radio shows that I went on. So I was on for like 2 hours, and people would call in with questions, and literally every single one of them, someone would call in and say something to the effect, well, this is very interesting, but I want to talk about the Lincoln assassination because I think there was a different conspiracy involved, and John Wilkes Booth wasn't really killed in that barn, and he was still alive. And it's interesting because some things do never go away, and yeah, we're closer to the Kennedy assassination, but I think there are still people out there that think that there's something more to be learned about the Lincoln assassination.
Did you ever feel like the interest in the Kennedy assassination was fading for a bit? It seems like just looking at, I guess, the announcements and old videos and stuff like that, there's a large amount like in the early 2000s, I'd say, and maybe a little bit, not around the time the Assassination Records Review Board was out, but a couple period years afterwards, and maybe until like the early 2000s, it seems like there wasn't that much coverage on the JFK assassination. I'm just curious through all your work and kind of digging through stuff, did you ever feel any maybe political tension or just something that was kind of covering the atmosphere when it came to looking or just making aware of the historical record of the JFK assassination?
I think from time to time in history, there's a little bit of an exhaustion factor. We've heard enough about that. There's nothing more to know. That probably occurred after we went out of office and there were no longer these weekly disclosures that we were making, which attracted some level of news. And at least we were in the news on a somewhat regular basis, and the hearings got a lot of coverage locally where we had them. But after that, I think it did fade for a while. But then there was a buildup to 2017. Part of it is the energy and the discovery made by researchers. And when they find something new and it's publicized, there's a level of interest that bubbles up again. So I don't think it'll ever go away. I just don't think that it's ever really been politicized. I hope it hasn't. Um, Oliver Stone has his viewpoints on it, and he's very serious about his viewpoints. And I find him to be a fascinating guy. I don't necessarily agree with his conclusions on a lot of material, but at the same time, he's kept a lot of the interest alive himself because of his viewpoint on what happened.
You said you don't think that it's been kind of hijacked by like political issues. I mean, like even with like some of the hearing stuff today, a lot of stuff seemed like it was trying to croach out like the church committee, like focusing into the agencies and other things. And I get that's like a lot of people's theories, military industrial complex. I'm not even gonna discuss that, but there's a lot of things I've noticed now where like Epstein was brought up and a bunch of stuff where I don't know if it hurts the historical record, but it hurts kind of like my generation wanting to get interested in the historical thing. Like, in my opinion, I think there's a lot of evidence to support that the Warren Commission didn't necessarily get it right when it not came to maybe not the conclusion. I have no clue on that, but just certain details and certain information that we've learned later that the picture from 63 is a lot different than what we know now in 2025. And I think we should update based on either the work and interviews of the HSCA, which I think they did a phenomenal job, and information that you guys were able to get from the Assassination Records Review Board as well, too.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I thinking about the Warren Commission. I mean, they had it was a group of what President Johnson believed were wise men. It wasn't a special investigating body. It was under LBJ's control, and the Chief Justice ran it, and it was, I think, designed to make sure that if there was a conclusion that would be damaging to the country, damaging to what options that President Johnson had, it would be not shared with the American public. I think that was clearly the thinking that went on there. They had a very good legal staff. They had a lot of top-notch lawyers, both the senior tier lawyers that worked for the Warren Commission and the lower level lawyers who I think did really a phenomenal job. But the investigation was largely done for them by the FBI, still under Hoover's control. And the CIA shared virtually nothing with the Warren Commission. So everything the CIA was doing in their investigation into the assassination, and in fact their ties to Oswald in the time preceding the assassination, none of that was part of the Warren Commission discussion. None of the attempts to kill Castro, any of those issues were before the Warren Commission, despite the fact that the former CIA director sat on the Warren Commission and knew full well what was going on in Cuba. So you've got real gaps in what was presented to the commission for their ultimate decision. Not taking away from any of the work that the lawyers did, because I thought they did a really good job. And I've read through the 26 volumes that they wrote. It's interesting. I actually have a set and have gone through all of that. But at the same time, it was missing big parts. And the House Select Committee did a really good job of gathering a lot of information that wasn't gathered by the Warren Commission, and certainly they had the benefit of the Church Committee investigations, the Rockefeller Commission investigations, everything that occurred in the mid 70s. But the House Select Committee also stopped their work early because they really ran out of money and effort and enthusiasm on the part of the Congress. They didn't really fully complete their work. It probably would have taken them quite a number of years to get into everything that they wanted to get into. And so there again, you have an investigation that is something less than the whole. And so I think any way to kind of fully summarize and get into where private researchers have been investigating since that time would be good for the public.
Before a long-winded question, I want to ask you about the Warren Commission, what you just said. Was this something you were aware of, or did you discover this during your time at the Assassination Records Review Board? I think a lot of people go, the Warren Commission, these members did a great job. And I'm not saying they didn't, but if you really look at it, the kind of conclusion was to reiterate the FBI's initial investigation. I have many phone calls and many recordings and stuff like that are on my channel of LBJ, and this is the overall plan. I think now it's not even a conspiracy. Now it's actually, if you Google that, it will pop up and show you like history.com or something mentioning something about it. Was that new to you? And also the withholding of information from the FBI, the CIA, from the commission staff, and even Gerald Ford reporting back certain information that was going on against the commission's discussions. Was this all something that you knew about already, or this you just come across or learning it after the fact?
No, I think we learned that as part of our work at the Assassination Records Review Board. I hadn't It wasn't a subject I paid that close attention to before, but it was pretty obvious. I mean, listen, I think the Warren Commission did an excellent job based on what they had. They just they There were some drawbacks there that are significant. One is, the FBI's investigation. I mean, the FBI, I think, for the most part, did a pretty good job there with the investigation, but you can't ignore the fact that they were working under J. Edgar Hoover, who was, someone that controlled things in a big way. And the fact that the CIA and Angleton was still around doing whatever he was doing. I mean, that was not part of their investigation. And so I think that the whole Mexico City aspect, which was taken over by the CIA, and the House Select Committee did better work there at Mexico City than I think that the Warren Commission did, because they had more information available to them and they had more insight into what the CIA was doing by that point in time. But these are things that if you dive into this, you learn it relatively quickly that there was information that wasn't available to them.
Were you aware of Hoover just hiding or being so secretive? I don't know when that history of Hoover came out. I think history has a bit of a different picture based on things like COINTELPRO and stuff of that sort. But I didn't know like if this was a well-known thing back then that Hoover had like blackmail file. Maybe it might have been rumored around the office, but I've looked more into the FBI's just and Hoover's control of things, and there was a lot of fear with Hoover. There was a lot of things that were going on that just is very overall shocking.
Well, it is shocking because I mean he kept his job, he controlled politicians based on information that he had in his files. We searched for those files as part of our work on the Assassination Records Review Board because obviously that potentially was relevant to the assassination. And when one of his top assistants,
Gladys secretary, yeah.
well, one of the Moore, I think his last name was, when he died, we had staff over to see if he had anything in his attic or in his files that were left over from Hoover's secret files, and we found nothing, but we tried because those files are legendary. But I think that largely they were destroyed when he passed away because it was pretty embarrassing to people around him, the kinds of stuff that he kept in files that he could use to essentially blackmail people. And that was the person running the FBI during the time that they were providing investigation services to the Warren Commission. So you can speculate on what impact it had. I think the agents always work very well and in full control of what they're doing. But when you have a boss telling them what to do, that's a different story. And remember that Hoover announced, the afternoon of the assassination, that it was a lone assassin and the case was closed before there was any investigation of any kind. So you can tell where his mind was going.
Yeah, Gladys's secretary, I think her name is. I can put the clip I have of her in the episode description so people can be able to click it when they're hearing this. But yeah, she talked about going to Hoover's house with a bunch of filing cabinets with an agent and burning them over 3 days. And she even testified that, yeah, that was the promise I made to him, which to me was just so shocking because these are people that are running, something important in our government, our intelligence agencies, and you necessarily don't think about this stuff. So I just wanted to know if it was a shocking thing to you. But for the members of the Assassination Records Review Board, did you share opinions with them? Did you have any differing opinions on information that you were learning about the JFK assassination?
No, I think we kind of learned together. I mean, it was a group that, I was the only lawyer in the group. The others were historians and, academics and archivists, basically. And that was part of the theory behind this, to have that kind of expertise, the historical expertise, to keep this all in perspective. And I was the lone lawyer position on the board. And, I would say that there were times when we had some minor differences of opinion, but for the most part, we acted unanimously on just about everything. Um, I think the tougher questions were when uh, I remember a relatively tough question. I'm assuming that this information has been all released now, but a lot of the information about Mexico City, the fact that the CIA and the FBI were bugging embassies there and sharing the information with the Mexican government with their acquiescence, that was a big concern on the part of the State Department that the government then running Mexico, which is the same political party as was in charge in the 1960s, would fall if this information was public, that they had cooperated so closely with the FBI and the CIA. And we had a little bit of a difference of opinion on whether to release that information. It was rather sensitive at the time. It's no longer sensitive today. And it was no longer sensitive 5 or 6 years after we were done with our work because a new political party was in charge in Mexico. So, I mean, those are the kinds of things that were somewhat difficult decisions for us because of the potential impact of our decision.
Now, how sure are you that Oswald went to Mexico City? The reason I ask that is because that's still a very controversial point for researchers and people that look into this because of the fact I think there is Hoover saying that it wasn't him, or we have a photo of a person that it turns out it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. You have Sylvia Duran saying that he went there 3 times in one day, not 3 times over 3 days. So that's in our HOCA interview, and there's just so much back and forth. Did he take a bus? Where did he get them? And it just goes into so much where you're sure that he went to Mexico City, and also how difficult was that to navigate through the Mexico City venture?
Well, I mean, I have no reason to believe that it was not Oswald who went to Mexico City. He had this rationale that he was going to secure a visa to go back to Moscow, maybe through Cuba. Maybe he would have done something that would make him be more important than he was the first time around. Um, I don't have any reason to believe that it wasn't him. I mean, I understand the theories and the imposter theory and everything like that, but um, part of the problem is the files are a little bit incomplete. The Lopez memo, which we ended up releasing virtually all of that, it had been severely redacted, was done by the House Select Committee. That was a summary of the trip, and it's a very interesting document. Um, but I've always been of the view that part of the idea behind getting permission to bug these embassies, to have listening devices in the Soviet embassy and in um, uh, the Cuban embassy and other adversaries of ours, would have to have been by agreement with the Mexican government. I would have thought it would be impossible to do it on our own. And both the FBI and the CIA had surveillance in those embassies. And my thinking all along had been that I'm sure that we shared copies of what we heard with the Mexican government, that was probably a quid pro quo. As long as you give it to us, we'll let you do it. We'll facilitate your doing this because we want that information too. Um, I've always thought that perhaps somewhere in a basement of some archives building or maybe even a warehouse, there are copies of these tape recordings. I worked with the CIA to try to get access to them. I never got an answer back for sure, so that's still kind of up there. It's just a theory of mine, but it seems logical that they would have to share information because these tape recordings, you ask them, they say that they were recorded over routinely. But there is evidence that that CIA had copies of some of these latest in December after the assassination. I've not seen an audio recording of any of it. Nothing was delivered to us by the CIA or the FBI. And so I think there's still a mystery there. That would be very helpful to find to gain access to something like that. The whole Mexico City thing is still somewhat mysterious. Part of the problem is that the Mexico City aspect of the investigation was handled by the CIA office there, Wynn Scott, who was the agent in charge, but it was taken away from him by James Angleton about 2 to 3 weeks or so after the assassination, and went into Angleton's own investigation to the extent that you can call it that. Was it an investigation, or was it more a cover up of the fact that the CIA knew who Oswald was in advance? And it did not alert the Secret Service to the fact that this guy might be dangerous.
There was a person during the HSCA's time, Floyd Fithian. He brought up a very good question when it came to questioning people like, I'm not going to say James Angleton. I think it was, God, CIA director Helms, Richard Helms. He asked him a question about the language that is used by certain agencies. It's very manipulative language when it came to certain. They're basically saying something, but they're not admitting to anything. It's kind of one of those tricky. He called it Floyd Fithian called it a lawyer question. I'm curious, with your background as a lawyer, did you look at some of these documents and were you able to point out certain language that necessarily wasn't admitting to anything, wasn't saying that they weren't involved, wasn't lying, but it was just a good choice of wording to be able to avoid truly answering the question?
Yeah, there's a lot of that in the records. I sort of refer to it as the non-denial denial, because that's essentially what it is. It's a way of denying something without really denying it through the use of language. And I think that records show a lot of that, particularly records of the investigations. Records kind of deep within the Warren Commission investigation, within the House Select Committee's investigation. And certainly, the records of that we were able to release from the Church Committee, that was true as well. Angleton's testimony to the Church Committee was finally released. Not sure why that wasn't handed over to us. It should have been in the 1990s. It wasn't. It's among a list of things that I'm seeing now that should have been within our purview in 1994 and 1998 and was not turned over by the agency. They're the people who we worked with, the people in their declassification office, whatever, were excellent. They were helpful and they wanted to get stuff out. The higher ups were less excited about us and would come in and tell us why we couldn't release information. Most of the time, we said, "Well, we don't agree with you, and we're going to release it." But in the lower level, people were really great. So I have to think that if they had that in their hands at the time, they were told not to disclose it to us. And I think there's more than a few examples of that.
When you found out that Jeremy Gunn could ask certain questions that you didn't think you guys had the power to do for the Assassination Records Review Board, more get really important medical information out of certain individuals that were either involved in the autopsy or had something that was involved more in the medical evidence, when did you find out that the National Archives took over the role for the Assassination Records Review Board? Because I'm not gonna lie, I have a lot of hesitancy with them just on the basis of that. I think a lot of this stuff was just really laid low and nobody cared about even looking or declassifying things. I'm still having issues. There's HSCA collections. There's Frank Sturgis tapes that were just released that are not online. All this stuff should be available online, but I've heard from so many researchers the difficulties of dealing with the National Archives to even get access to the material to look at it themselves. And I get the privacy or whatever their job and security protocols are, but for me, the National Archives kind of sits at like a lack of caring. I'm not saying it was anybody that might have been involved in earlier years. It just seems like now that we can look things up on the internet, I would expect a lot of this stuff, tapes, certain things that just would be first thing if I see we have a box of Frank Sturgis tapes, I'm like, hey, I'm going to run down and go get these burned and try and put them online for the public to be able to hear what's going on if we're releasing them, because not everybody can make it to College Park.
Yeah, most people can't go to College Park, even though it's a nice facility there. I was there when they dedicated the facility and they moved all the Kennedy assassination stuff there. I think part of it in their defense is lack of resources, uh, too many uh, too many records from too many places to try to organize at the same time. But at the same time, I don't think that after we were out of office, they put as much of a priority on these records, even though the law was still there. We were gone, but they had at least some authority coming out of that, and should have still recognized it as a priority. And part of it is the retirement of people who were very good at and knew this collection really well, and pushed and got things released quickly and got things available to the public really fast. And it just, when they were gone, someone new would take over, and you lose all that uh, knowledge and wealth of experience. And I think that's part of the problem plaguing the archives as well. Stephen Tilley was terrific. He was just absolutely the best. I could call him and say, Steve, what's this about? He'd have an answer. If he didn't know the answer, he'd be back to me in 15 minutes with the answer. He was just outstanding. And they just haven't had that kind of caliber of persons working with the files since then.
What do you think about certain footage, like of the church committee and other historical things that happen to do with the JFK assassination, that are blocked by certain paywalls? There are certain individuals, companies, AP News, MPI, I think videos is what they're called. They have so much recordings of the church committee of whatever they pulled it off an NPR camera or of some other thing. I feel like that should be in the public domain. Um, because a lot of it's like clips, but you have to spend like $45 for like a 30-minute conversation. And for a lot of people, that's not a lot of money. But for anyone that's new and wants to see or just wants the information, I just think it should be publicly available.
Well, that was our goal, to get the biggest collection possible, make it free and available to the public. And the digitalization process has made it much easier for people to see. And originally, it was just an outline, an index that was on the internet, and now they've been getting more and more records. But all of that stuff should be available. Um, Wherever it is, it should be available publicly, in my view, without cost, or for only a minor cost. We were. I was a little irritated with the sixth floor museum in Dallas when we were doing our work. Gary Mack, who was running that's a great guy, and he was doing a really good job of collecting information. And ultimately, my thinking was, well, if they make it available to the public, it's not the National Archives. I'd rather have it at the National Archives. More likely, the National Archives would still be in operation, 200 years from now, than the sixth floor museum in Dallas. But at the same time, at least it's publicly available. So it wasn't. I didn't want to have a fight with them over documents. That was counterproductive. But there are records in places that they do charge for, and I think that's unfortunate, because the public really needs to have full and complete access. Otherwise, they're just, someone's hiding something, and we don't want to hide anything anymore.
I have just two last questions for you. One is, at any time when you were with the Assassination Records Review Board, did you feel like when it ended that it was kind of set that way on purpose because of the fact that you were looking into certain areas of the government, that obviously certain agencies would do their best not to create roadblocks, but should just wait you out? A lot of people did that with the HSCA. They look for the work the HSCA did. Mexico City, interrogating Marina more, trying to get a better background on motive, trying to understand if the Walker shooting happened, if other certain things happened. There was a lot of things the HSCA exposed that the Warren Commission had gotten wrong, and I give them major credit for, because questions were asked 20 times over, to the point where, like, they're on day 3 of Marina's testimony and the guy's still asking, like, you couldn't tell me this, and he has a good southern accent, so it makes it even better. But he's like, you couldn't tell me this, you still can't tell me this, I'm not even going to ask you this. And I'm just like, at least everyone's kind of getting the wanting to know something about it, like, let's get into this a little bit more. But they had problems with agencies. Blakey overall said that he felt that if they had more time, but he thought that it was kind of like just waiting them out. Did you feel that with the Assassination Records Review Board?
I was concerned about that throughout our entire period. We were given 3 years. It took us a while to get started, because we were confirmed, and we looked at each other and said, like, now what? There was no appropriation, there was no office, there was no nothing. I called the White House chief of staff, who I knew, and said, hey, we got to get started with this. This is really important. Are there funds anywhere? And he gave us $500,000 out of a White House undesignated fund to get started, so that we could get started before I could get to Congress and request an appropriation. Uh, we uh, we had, under the statute, the ability to ask for one more year. I did. We got it. Um, Theoretically, we could have asked for more time. Maybe, I don't know if we would have gotten it. The House The Republican chair of the House Government Operations Committee was pretty clear about, well, this is your last year now. Um, I'm sure that some agencies were making an argument behind the scenes. I never heard it stated to me, but that let's get this uh, organization done with. They're kind of creating a ruckus here within our agency. I wouldn't be surprised if that was talked about behind closed doors. Not certainly not in front of us. Um, but there was a problem in the way it was structured. The biggest problem for me was not only that agencies could conceivably wait us out, which I'm sure was the goal of particularly the CIA. I'm not sure about other agencies. Um, but we started losing staff members. Um, when you know your job ends on September 30th, 1998, and you've got nothing for October 1st of 1998, you're probably going to start looking for a job earlier. We lost David Marwell to the Holocaust Museum. Tom Samlick had to leave early for another job, I think with Scott Harshbarger. I think that's what he did. I mean, these people needed jobs. They needed to continue. We had a group that were without jobs the day we ended our work. And, I think everyone did fine in moving on to something else. But when you know your job is ending, you're going to start thinking you're looking about what the next job is going to be. And that was definitely a drawback for us because we David left, Jeremy took over. Jeremy left a little early as well. Laura Dink took his place. I mean, they're all great staffers and they did great work for us way up until the end. But we lost some key staffers along the way solely because we were a temporary agency. And I think that's unfortunate how it was set up. I think they should have set it up that we could do the work until we felt it was through, although over with, although we would be viewed as a temporary agency, not a permanent agency. And we were all very supportive of that concept. But leaving it open so that we could keep our staff longer, I think would have been helpful for us.
Well, I'm very appreciative of the work that you did for the Assassination Records Review Board and what the ARRB did for younger generation researchers like myself to be able to catch up and look at certain information and still keep an interest as much as I have an interest over it for the past 3 years. But my final question to you is when it comes to determinations or just things moving forward, when it came to obviously we have disclosure on a lot more documents, but heading about this in the right way when it comes to if there is going to be another hearing, when it does come to accessing information and choosing not to ruin the historical record by coming up or filling in lines with certain information that we don't have. I want to get your thoughts just moving on what you would like to see in the next couple of years when it came to the JFK assassination discussion.
Well, I would like to see kind of a final accounting of where we are at right now. What is still redacted, if anything? I think there are some redactions still. I would like to see agency heads come in and testify that they have searched thoroughly and have found no further records whatsoever. I'd like to see that, have them on record under oath saying that. I think that would be very helpful because everyone believes there's still stuff being hidden someplace. The FBI came up with all these additional records that were not shown to the review board. I'm guessing they were in field offices, but I haven't seen them yet. I'm anxious to see what they are. Even our excellent FBI liaison, who worked very closely with us, who's long since retired now, didn't know about this at all. When I talked with him, let's get everyone on record that there's nothing more, because I think people are still going to think there's something hidden in someone's safe in the basement of a CIA facility someplace. But we can only do what we can do, and I hope that we can get as much on the record of the efforts to find additional records that we possibly can, not just people responding to a presidential order, which I think was great because they found more stuff that they could bring in. But at the same time, I think we need more. That's what I would like to see. And if there isn't that kind of willingness to declare an oath, then I think you need to investigate what's going on.
Well, on behalf of all the researchers and people that have been interested in the JFK assassination, I'd like to thank you for giving me the time to be able to discuss some of this stuff, and for all the other times as well too. It really means a lot. Um, I have links from your previous episode. I'm going to put in the description below for people to be able to check out. Is there anything else you would like me to provide for links for you?
No, that's probably good. I as a judge, I tend to stay away from social media because we've been advised we should do that, and so I do. But I hope I was really encouraged by the House having these hearings, and it went a little awry at times. I didn't watch all of it; I had a little bit of it on. But at the same time, bringing light to this information, I think, is really important. So I applaud that, and I hope they have more hearings.
Thank you again, and thank you everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.
Thank you, Robbie.